Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Ich warte seit Wochen auf diesen Tag und tanz vor Freude über den Asphalt. Als wär's ein Rhythmus, als gäb's ein Lied, das mich immer weiter durch die Straßen zieht. Komm dir entgegen.
Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manuel Feed, he's Stefan Biankowski. Stefan, how's it going?
I'm doing very, very well, mate. Well rested, ready for another week of football. Looking forward to Celtic versus Leipzig, which will be on tonight when people are listening, most likely. So yeah, very much looking forward to that. And another excellent weekend of German football. How are you?
Good, yeah. Just got back to Canada last night. Was nice, direct flight, Vancouver, Munich, no problem. 9 hours, straight shot. Missed Germany already, but it looks like I'm going to be back pretty soon. And I'm looking forward to your coverage of the Leipzig game. I had the pleasure to be there last week, and it was a fascinating match to watch. And I'm really curious I'm kind of jealous because Celtic Park is one of the stadiums on my list. I think you're going to witness quite a great atmosphere, which you probably know. I mean, you lived in Glasgow for so long.
I've been to a few Champions League nights at Celtic Park, and I can honestly say they're pretty much unrivaled. I got to say, actually, it's maybe not the best time to say this, but I remember being at a Der Klassiker between Dortmund and Bayern at the Westfalenstadion, and I was actually a little bit disappointed in the atmosphere back then, just because I've been to Old Firm matches, and I've never been to Ibrox for a Champions League match. I was hoping to go this week, but it didn't come through. But yeah, Celtic Park was quite special. So if anyone's looking to do a bit of football tourism, I couldn't recommend either Glasgow club more, to be honest.
Dortmund is great. It really is. And we're going to talk about it a little bit towards the end of the show, because obviously we're going to cover the Klassiker. But for the Klassiker, you have to remember this is a manufactured rivalry.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it was fantastic for the Revier Derby. Absolutely incredible. When it comes to normal Champions League nights in German football, and I sound like a broken record, it's Frankfurt for me.
Yeah. Well, I must say I was at the Allianz Arena at the end of last season for the other Der Klassiker, and I was really impressed with the stadium there as well, the home crowd there. So you wouldn't think as much because Bayern are obviously perceived as a super club, but their home fans know exactly how to sing and make a racket.
Yeah, the Südkurve is getting often wrongly a bad reputation, I think. And the way that now that I've been back to the Allianz Arena and they lit it out differently, they have done some upgrades, looks fabulous. There's a picture that I shared on social, right, where it's just completely lit up inside red, and it looks dooming almost.
And it's obviously designed really well because the sounds just echo off the roof, which curves in, and it's tremendous. It really is tremendous stadium.
It's gorgeous, and it's going to get. I mean, this is kind of off topic, but it's going to have the NFL soon, right? And there's rumors that it might actually get a permanent NFL team. Which would be just giving more money to Bayern. Before, another 8 home games for the Munich Bavarians in another game called football, but that's completely off topic. We'll dive into that maybe when it comes. But we'll have lots to discuss, and we should probably do it after this break.
This episode of the Gegenpressing podcast is brought to you by BetOnline. Football is back, and BetOnline remains your number one source for all your football betting needs this season. You'll find the latest odds, matchup info, player news, and game trends. And as your continued source for all sports wagering info, BetOnline features live betting, free contests, live scores, and giveaways all season long. Always the fastest and easiest way to bet all your favorite sports and events like MLB, MMA, tennis, boxing, and even golf. Head to betonline.ag. BetOnline.ag, To join and receive your 100% welcome bonus with your first deposit, make sure to use promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, BELIEVE, BLEAV to receive your rewards. Bet online, where the game starts.
So yeah, Stefan, off the top, we need to talk about a coaching change. Happened just before we record this episode on Monday afternoon, German time, UK time, Monday morning, Thanksgiving morning in Canada. Pellegrino Matarazzo released off his duties in Stuttgart. And this is probably one of those coaching changes where the club was really heavily reluctant to do it. And when you really read the statements that were released by the club, and they actually they gave a statement to Pellegrino Matarazzo too in the press release, which is always an indication that, you know, if the coach is involved still in the press release, that was something that the club really didn't want to do. Reluctantly released head coach Pellegrino Matarazzo after still being winless in the 2022-23 season. 5 points after 9 games. I think this is one of those things where everyone is very happy with the playing style. Everyone is really happy with the culture that the head coach has brought to the club. But results just mean that it was untenable to continue. And it's kind of really similar to and we're going to talk about Alonso in a bit too, but it's kind of similar to the Sione story, isn't it? That they felt like they had the right head coach, but because results weren't coming, sometimes you just have to do it.
Yeah, it seemed like a begrudging decision to make, and it, with Siona at Leverkusen, everyone loved him, everyone thought he was a very good coach, but it got to a point where they said there's just no real way to turn this around anymore, and you're throwing good money after bad after a while, and I guess this is the same as Stuttgart. I feel like Matarazzo's probably a victim of circumstance more than anything else. I dare say the club itself maybe thinks that as well, just because the transfer window was pretty uneventful, except for the fact that they sold Mangala to Nottingham Forest, they've sold Kaladzic to Wolves, and it's easy to kind of forget about Kaladzic because he's obviously been injured since he made the move to the Wolves. But we were saying at the time, I know I certainly was, that I thought that was almost like a death sentence for Stuttgart, in my opinion. So important to them, even though he has been injured a lot the last couple of seasons. But when he's played, he's been so key to everything they've done well. And he obviously gets the best out of their other key players like Salas and, the fullbacks and the central midfielders and things like that. So after that transfer window, it seemed to me like Stuttgart were almost like a dead man walking, if you want to use that bizarre expression. And I know they've been linked with a few interesting names. Honez is an interesting one to be linked with because I thought he actually did a very good job last season. But looking at that squad, I do kind of wonder, what can be expected of it. There's some decent players in there, don't get me wrong, but considering the kind of strength in the Bundesliga this season, and the fact that even Bochum seem to be still putting in a fight, I really would be concerned for Stuttgart, and I wouldn't really envy the next guy who has to come in there.
Yeah, I think the one thing that people always have to remember about the Bundesliga is it's just 18 teams, right? The likelihood of a big side going down is far greater than it is in any of the other top 4 leagues in Europe, which does mean that the margin for error for a side like Stuttgart that could easily in a good year finish in the top 7, but in a bad year could get relegated is much smaller. And I can, with that in mind, understand why they made this decision. And it is also interesting to note too, because Stuttgart is one of those teams that every year had a new manager. Matarazzo now lasted for 100 games, 1,000 days, which is long for Stuttgart in terms of Stuttgart. And I guess whoever comes in next, Adi Hütter is another name, right? Who I think is an excellent coach. Maybe we're also going to get surprised. I mean, Stuttgart did surprise us by hiring Pellegrino Matarazzo in the first place, and maybe they're going to think completely outside of the box and do completely something different. Sami Khedira, the former World Cup winning central midfielder, is also part of the decision-making process there. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if he has any sort of input into what's going to come next. Sven Mislintat, of course, the former Dortmund and Arsenal, what was it, head scout, right? He's now a sporting director there. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think there is some really good pieces in this side. Thiago Thomas is one, right, that we have highlighted, which just hasn't been going this year. Guirassy got sent off against Union Berlin. And I think there is some good pieces there. It's just someone needs to just come in and just kind of teach them how to score goals again.
Yeah, without a doubt. And we'll have to kind of wait and see if they can do that. I think it's also really interesting in the timing of these decisions, because you kind of look at the Bundesliga table, you can see a lot of the teams that Stuttgart would have been hoping to be up ahead of are actually now kind of beginning to pull away from them. You know, Augsburg have put a decent run of form. Wolfsburg look like they may have turned things around under Niko Kovac. Hertha Berlin, haven't lost in the last 5 games. So these other teams who, if they were having a similarly tough go of it, Stuttgart might have thought we might have a bit more time here, but they've now maybe thought if we don't act now, we're going to end up finding ourselves considerably behind the teams that we would hope would cushion us between now and relegation.
Yeah, I think that's very important to point out. It's as you said, it's a victim of circumstances, right? And I think it's kind of important too what's going to happen next to Pellegrino Matarazzo. We talked about it off air because you were asking me whether he's going to be maybe in line for the US men's national team job with whatever happens at the World Cup. And I think it's important to point out here that he's very much integrated into German society. I don't know the exact amount of years he's been living there, but it's probably been a couple decades. And he's married to a German. His family's kids are German. He speaks only German at home. I did a roundtable with him last year, media roundtable, and his English was kind of rudimentary. Obviously, he still speaks it because he speaks it with family at home, but there's also a lot of Italian spoken, right? Because his background is Italian-American. And he has said in the past he would only take a job if he could stay in the greater New York area. I have to go back to the United States, which limits where he could go.
Do you know what I've just thought of? Is he like the opposite Jurgen Klinsmann?
Yeah.
That's actually, he's an American. He's an American who never wants to leave Germany, where Jurgen Klinsmann's a German who never wants to leave America.
Well, this is the question, right? If is offered the U.S. men's national team job after the World Cup, would they be happy with him living in Germany? I would think not. I mean, it is easy to get from Germany to New York. There's many direct flights, but I think too, the World Cup break is maybe going to lead to some coaching decisions and changes in the Bundesliga. And I would say that he's probably pretty high up on the list of many other Bundesliga teams. Or maybe even a second division team looking to get a jump on promotion, but maybe struggling, right? Because he has a history of getting promoted.
Yeah, right? No, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. He did a very good job at Stuttgart up until this season, and I think those within the game and those within the industry will appreciate that that wasn't his fault. So I'd be very surprised if he struggled to get another job after this.
Yeah, he's still very much in that mix. So we'll see. I think that is probably on balance that everything we can say about Stuttgart. I guess we'll have to kind of keep an eye on who's next. As I said, Adi Hütter, Sebastian Hoeneß. Those are 2 names linked. Sebastian Hoeneß's father, Dieter Hoeneß, used to be the manager, which is of course now called sporting director in German football, at Stuttgart for a long time. So still some links there as well. Will be an interesting one to keep an eye on. Let's talk about a club that's already made a coaching decision. And this was your game of the week, actually, right? Bayer Leverkusen, rebound win, 4-0 against Schalke. I watched this game and I was very impressed, and I was very keen on watching what Alonso would decide in terms of how he fielded his team. He went for a 3-4-3. And he was very much involved in the game, spent a lot of time talking to the players during the match, lots of interaction, very active on the sideline. And yeah, I was also very impressed by his pretty good ability still to speak German. He gave a lot of interviews. Of course, every once in a while he had to switch into English and sometimes use Spanish terms, but he's very much trying to speak German with the press. And I think overall, a very good reaction by Leverkusen under a new head coach, Xabi Alonso.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they blew Schalke away. Another match in which Schalke looked very ordinary, and I'm now beginning to kind of fear for them. That's the third loss in the bounce now. After that defeat to Augsburg last weekend. But it struck me just how quickly the team and the players seemed to get on board with what he was saying. The thing that really struck me actually, and it was in the first half when Leverkusen basically played a really audacious kind of like set piece from their goal kick, where Hradecky kind of lobbed the ball over a Schalke forward to Frimpong, who was on the sideline, who passed it right down the line to Diaby. And then, Diaby managed to cut inside, and I think he managed to square it to Patrick Schick, who got a shot away. And that was a move straight from kickoff, and it completely took Schalke by surprise. And it might not sound very impressive, like just listening, but if anyone watched it, I think they might, and they remember, they'll know what I mean. It was it was like a set piece routine. It's almost like something from like an NFL playbook, to be honest with you. With Hradecky is almost like the quarterback, but that surprised me in the level of detail which he's maybe already managed to get across. The thing that really struck me was that he really paid a lot of attention to width in this team, which obviously, Leverkusen having Spades, I don't think it was a surprise that obviously Bakker was back at left back because he offers that kind of width as well. Hudson-Odoi did a really good job kind of on the left, while you had Frimpong and Diaby, who were just constant torment on the right-hand side. And, obviously, it's that kind of opening goal from Diaby, just an absolute screamer. And then a few minutes later, Frimpong knocks in a similarly impressive goal, and you're like, well, there we go. There was nothing to worry about. And these things happen in football all the time, and I always find myself chuckling away, thinking of poor Gerardo Siona sitting in his living room watching this game with his hands in his ears and hands in the air, saying, "Where the hell was all this a couple of weeks ago?" These guys were just playing with so much freedom, no pressure, and it looked like they were all willing to run through walls for Xabi Alonso. So great start for him, but Schalke couldn't have possibly you couldn't have found a better kind of start than Schalke at home. And I think obviously we'll have to kind of see how they do in the Champions League this week against Porto, if I'm not mistaken. And then of course they've got Frankfurt away after that, which would be very difficult. So it's one to keep an eye on, but very exciting start.
Yeah, I'm just really curious to see whether this 3-4-3 is now the way going forward. And another thing that I noticed is that Paulinho was back in the squad, someone who was more or less on the verge of being sold and always had the talent, right? And a coaching change is always an opportunity for someone who has been on the fringe to come back in and reassert themselves. And Paulinho comes in and scores off the bench. And I always thought Paulinho was a really highly talented player. Maybe Alonso will be able to sort of give value to something that was frozen, a frozen asset, right? And or distressed asset, if you want to use a banking term here, which that can be underestimated as well. And sometimes a coaching change like that is important. I think too that what I also really was impressed with, Diaby was hugely impressive, right? He picks up a goal and 2 assists. Frimpong, I thought, was very good as well. And Callum Hudson-Odoi, he spent a ton of time talking to him as well. And if you're a Chelsea fan and you're sort of keeping an eye on how he's doing there, and there has been rumors about him possibly being recalled, right? Because of Graham Potter maybe having a different view of CHO than Tuchel did previously. But if you're a Chelsea fan, you're probably quite pleased by the fact that Xabi Alonso is now there. And it's all really positive. And the other thing, and this is something that we already touched on last week, right? It's also a really positive story for the league. I think the media attention this has been getting, rightfully so, because of who Xabi Alonso is as a person, is really, really great for the league. And also, was an interesting one. Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, the Bayern CEO, former Bayern CEO, speaking out about really being impressed by Xabi Alonso start at Leverkusen, but also about his departure in the past. And there's, of course, now already conversation that this job, if he does well there, could lead to a Bayern job in the future, which is probably something that Julian Nagelsmann doesn't want to hear. But yeah, I think all around Xabi Alonso coming to the league and being there, that's something that's just very, very good for the Bundesliga.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, without a doubt. It seems like that's almost a shoe-in, which I doubt Julian Nagelsmann will appreciate much. First, he has to deal with Thomas Tuchel losing his job. Now he has potentially Xabi Alonso breathing down his neck. So, and we just know how much Bayern love to bring in their own ex-players to kind of fill these roles when they can, which is something I think Julian Nagelsmann's maybe struggling with, to be honest. But we can talk about it in the next section possibly. But yeah, it's really exciting. It's really interesting. I'm hoping we can get a chance to kind of speak to him at some point, because he's obviously got so much he probably wants to speak about and what he wants to bring to the league, and it'd be very fascinating to see how that works out.
Yeah, I think it's the most interesting coaching appointment in a long time. And I might exaggerate here, but it could be, in my opinion, it's the most exciting coaching appointment since Pep Guardiola came to the Bundesliga, in terms of what it brings internationally to the club, right? Of course, Julian Nagelsmann to Leipzig was very exciting, and then Julian Nagelsmann to Bayern, but he's a known quantity for Bundesliga followers, right? Xabi Alonso is not, and he brings this huge name. And when you look at the coaches that he worked under that have influenced this game as well, there's some big names in there. Pep Guardiola, right, is one of them. And I think this is it's going to be really fascinating, really, really interesting, and hopefully something that will provide us with content for a long time, Stefan.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing how it works out.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about Julian Nagelsmann. Bayern Munich throw away a 2-0 lead against Borussia Dortmund. Now, we are used to teams throwing away leads at the Klassiker. Usually it's the team in black and yellow. This feels, when you know that we had a good 48 hours to digest this, and that I've now watched it back, because I was out on Saturday night with some friends because it was my last night in Munich. And so I only kept one eye on the game. So I had a chance to back watch it, watch the highlights, digest all the post-game commentary, the video of Oliver Kahn collapsing in the VIP box at the Signal Iduna Park. This feels like a Bayern Munich defeat.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And it just kind of maybe angling it towards Julian Nagelsmann for a moment. I think it was really interesting the way that he approached this result and the way that Bayern have kind of approached this result. And I was actually on Sony India, the Indian TV channel today, or today being Monday. They were asking me about this and Nagelsmann's comments after the game, and I basically said, well, he was making excuses for his team. He's making excuses for the result. He was saying, well, maybe Dortmund could have the player sent off, and it's not the end of the world. We'll be fine. It's not that big a deal. And I just think that contrasted so much, not only with the way that Bayern instantly reacted in terms of Oliver Kahn being the most obvious example, but just in general, the kind of culture at Bayern Munich, where, a 2-2 draw in that manner, as you said, is considered a defeat for Bayern Munich. I know it's at the Westfalenstadion. I know, it's an away game at Dortmund. Dortmund are supposed to be their main challengers, but the capitulation of that result just will not go down well at Bayern at all. And it really makes me think that there's still a huge gap between the way that Julian Nagelsmann goes about his day-to-day business at Bayern and the expectations that the club have for the manager they want him to be. Because I think Heiner, the president, gave an interview. I honestly can't remember if it was before or after this game. I think it was in Kicker. And, he was very complimentary about Nagelsmann. And he said, we obviously believe in him. That's why we gave him this 5-year contract. But he also made quite a telling comment where he basically said, well, he's used to coaching players at Hoffenheim and he's used to coaching players at Leipzig, and coaching players at Bayern Munich is very different. And that stood out to me because the way that Nagelsmann behaved after that game and the way he managed to kind of not laugh it off, but the way that he was able to accept that 2-2 draw looked like Julian Nagelsmann, the RB Leipzig head coach, rather than Julian Nagelsmann, the Bayern Munich head coach. And it just makes it. There's just these constant reminders that maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm just looking into this too much, or maybe I'm just a typical cynical journalist, and I'm just looking for narratives and stories. And if I am, then fair enough. Bayern fans can feel free to ignore it. But I do just kind of feel like sometimes that Nagelsmann does kind of leave not a lot to be desired, but he doesn't. Either he doesn't feel comfortable being that kind of head coach, or he's not capable of being that type of head coach. Because when I think of a Bayern Munich head coach, the person that pops into my head is Jupp Heynckes. This kind of stoic elder statesman type of head coach, or like a Louis van Gaal perhaps, or something like that. And
Ottmar Hitzfeld.
Yes, exactly. And I know they've had the head coaches since then that kind of have broke the mold in that regard. Obviously, Pep Guardiola was very young. Niko Kovac was very young. You could maybe argue that Hansi Flick wasn't exactly an old man, still isn't an old man by any means. So they have kind of moved with the times in that regard. But I still kind of feel like all of those guys, except Kovac, who obviously didn't work out for him, these guys all came with the pedigree and the experience to say, they could kind of put their hand down on the table and say, look, these are my credentials. I know what I'm doing here. And I feel like Nagelsmann doesn't have that, and it's almost like he's trying to compensate for a lack of credentials in that regard by being a little different, being a little aloof, and not really willingly playing his part as the traditional Bayern Munich head coach.
And I don't think he ever will. I think that's just not in his personality. I talked to some people in and around the club, and also people who cover the club full time, the beat writers, right, as you call them in stateside or North America. People who basically just cover one team, right? And there was definitely a sense that the way they feel about Nagelsmann, and obviously journalists have their grudges, right? It's just, especially those that work with the club day in and day out. But there was definitely a sense that they feel that Nagelsmann is a difficult person to work with. And that this sense of them having a difficult time of working with him at time also goes, is not just between them and the coaching staff, but also between the coaching staff and those people further up the hierarchy. There is also a sense, though, I think that the people at the hierarchy kind of are okay with it for now, because they consider, they knew that Nagelsmann was a project. I think that in some ways they had this anticipation that there would be setbacks and failures, and last year went really well for them, right? And this year it's not going quite so well, which I think some people would also recognize is due to the club having lost several key players. Again, this year with Lewandowski, another one. So that leads me to the next question, really. Like, yes, Nagelsmann is very difficult, and yes, he's navigating probably the club's first real transitional period. I mean, they sort of had a transition before, but it's now getting to a point where there's so many assets that have left the club and being replaced by younger assets that this is maybe the point now where it's really becoming the one golden generation trying to hand it over to another. And that's always very tricky, right? This is when it really becomes very difficult. And where I'm getting in with that is that maybe the club isn't any better than third place in the Bundesliga at the moment. While it's like enough in the Champions League, because like, yeah, they're playing Pilsen isn't exactly the opponent that's going to hurt them. And Barcelona are still in transition, and Inter Milan have their own problems. So maybe, they're getting the results there because they're playing other teams that are facing the same kind of obstacles, and also playing a style that favors them. But maybe in the Bundesliga, they are just at this sort of position, and they're maybe just a bit fortunate that Dortmund didn't have quite a start either, right? And I know it's still early. We're match day 9. I have to remember Chris Williams always said you shouldn't start reading the table until match day 10. But the trend isn't exactly their friend. And this seems like a year where we could finally see it. Someone else could win this league.
Yeah, well, if we do wait till match day 10, it might not be any help, might not be any better for Bayern because they're playing Freiburg next, so who could cause further anguish. And it's a very interesting point because if this continues, we're basically going to have to we're going to have one issue with two separate conclusions or two different ways of looking at it. I think the biggest issue for Bayern right now is that key players just aren't performing well. They were dreadful against Dortmund. I really thought they were really dreadful, and I think I was texting you maybe during the match or someone about saying that Bayern are really, this is when they were obviously leading before the comeback, and I was saying they're really going to get away with this because they have been terrible. And you could basically go through that entire team. Gnabry was terrible. Leroy Sané, shot aside, I thought was terrible, and actually notably at fault for just not doing any tracking back in the final third of the game. Sabitzer doing his best to get sent off. Goretzka, okay. He thought Goretzka was actually okay. Musiala, I thought, played well. Mane, terrible again. Davies, obviously injured. Upamecano and De Ligt, struggle, fine, nothing great. And I thought Manuel Neuer was kind of pretty average as well. And, and then Kingsley Coman comes on, gets himself sent off. Stanisic comes on, gets pulled apart by Adeyemi. Choupo-Moting brought on, useless as well. Joshua Kimmich, okay, one of the few bright lights. And I actually thought if Bayern had gone on and won that game, I would have pegged it on Kimmich coming on at half-time, to be honest with you. But there's just too many players in this team that are not performing well. And
haven't for a while.
Yeah, exactly. So if Bayern still find themselves, say we get to the winter break for the World Cup, and there's now, and at that point, there's a huge, break, and Bayern are still kind of lingering around this area. Maybe they have moved into first place, but they're only 1 or 2 points ahead, or they're still behind Union Berlin or on par with Dortmund. That board are probably going to have to sit down and say, either these players simply aren't good enough, or Julian Nagelsmann is not doing his job well enough. And even though I'm tempted to suggest, and probably agree with you to a large extent, that a lot of these players aren't good enough because, you could say what you want about, anyone can go online, anyone can go on YouTube and Google Serge Gnabry goals or Leroy Sané goals, and these guys will look like world beaters, but they're also notoriously inconsistent players.
Yeah.
Sadio Mane has really struggled to kind of fit into this team, so there's no guarantee that he'll be able to do well. So you could argue, I think you could feasibly argue that Nagelsmann has a tough task to deal with here, but I do wonder if Bayern Munich might sit down and be like, well, there's Thomas Tuchel sitting right there. So, we could, if they think what's the easier thing for us to do here? Is it easier for us to replace the head coach, or is it easier for us to replace the entire front line? And I like most teams, I think they'll probably just opt to pay off Nagelsmann and bring in Thomas Tuchel if that's where we still are in a month or two's time.
Yeah, that's a 25 million euro investment sunk.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't. I think that Nagelsmann would survive even missing on the title once.
Yeah, I think the Champions League's a key one, isn't it?
Yeah.
This all depends on how they do in the Champions League.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, they're going to get easily qualified from this group. They could qualify as early as this week. And I guess they will, because Inter and Barcelona haven't exactly looked fantastic either. And, I think mathematically a win against Victoria Pilsen will be enough. So that should do that. And then he has until the spring, right, when the Champions League resumes. And they have looked great there. They look like a completely different side in Europe. That's, I think, something as well to point out. Yes, they had their periods against Barcelona and Inter Milan where they had their weaknesses, but ultimately they managed to navigate them, which is something you can't say about the Bundesliga performances. In the Bundesliga, they have their moments of weaknesses, but they get punished, which is, I think, it's quite a fascinating storyline as well. And this was a case against Dortmund, right, where essentially for 20 minutes they had the same sort of performances or periods that they had in the Champions League previously, and Dortmund used that time to great effect. I mean, if Modeste puts away that one chance early on against Neuer, they might even lose this game.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. And like I actually looked at their XG during the match, and it was actually both teams had very minimal XG actually in this regard. So it's not as if Bayern really thumped them. It's really tricky. It's really tricky. I'm not by no means am I advocating that Bayern should be sacking Nagelsmann. I think he will probably benefit from the fact that the last 16 round isn't until February. If they had condensed the Champions League to the point where a couple of the knockout games would have been before the World Cup, then I think he may have been in trouble because he could have come up against a Manchester City or whatever else. But for now, I just think we just keep waiting for something to click for this Bayern team, and for them to really kind of push on and show what they're capable of, and it just isn't happening. And it's and all along the way, you're having people constantly talk about whether they should be signing number 9, and that's just the way it is at Bayern Munich. If you're not winning every game, you're basically you go from top to bottom very quickly.
You really worried if you're Tottenham Hotspur at this moment. This club is coming after your number 9, and they're coming after him hard. I wouldn't even be surprised if they accelerate the process during the World Cup. That's traditionally a period when teams do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, to kind of flip it back towards Dortmund, if Moukoko keeps doing what he's doing, they might be signing him in January.
He's been good. We need to point this out. We've been critical of Moukoko at the beginning of the season, but he's really turned it on. And he's really looking like the talented number 9, mega talented number 9 that many people reckoned he would become. I guess he's still so young. He's only 17, right? Has he turned 18 yet?
I don't think so. I can tell you right now.
I've been told that
he turns 18 in November.
Okay, so I've been told watch his 18th birthday when it comes to a contract renewal at Dortmund.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. He has been great. I thought he was outstanding in the Sevilla game. And you're absolutely right. We were kind of critical. We were concerned about whether he had the physique to kind of play as a true number 9, in the way that Sebastian Haller was obviously signed to do, and Anthony Modeste was then signed to do. But he's had a decent run of games, and he's been outstanding. I thought he was a bit quiet at moments in this Bayern game, but as soon as Modeste came on, as soon as he had someone to play off of, he was excellent. And that kind of that movement for that goal alongside Modeste was just exceptional. As I was saying on Twitter, if he keeps going like this, then there's no reason why he shouldn't be going to the World Cup with Germany, because they have hardly any number 9s, and he is as true as a number 9 as you're going to find.
He scores a goal every 88 minutes at the moment.
Yeah.
That's what you want, right?
Do you know who he reminds me a little of? He reminds me of like a young Michael Owen. In the sense that he's quite a small figure, but he's got that pace, and he likes to play off players, and he just bounces off defenders, and he's got that incredible finishing. I mean, that goal he scored against Bayern was not an easy finish from the kind of angle that he hit it from.
He's good in the air too, despite only being just under 6 feet, or 1.79 meters if you prefer centimeters. He's quite good in the air, actually. He scored a beautiful header against Schalke, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's 5'8", so he's a bit shorter than 6 foot, but yeah, he's quite a small player. But no, and he couldn't have come on at a better time for Dortmund, because they were really struggling to Modeste. Don't want to really hammer that point home too hard, because he obviously got his goal against Dortmund, but against Bayern, but that miss that he put in beforehand, it was as if it was written in the stars, and you were just kind of thinking, gosh, this is just not going to work out for him at all at Dortmund. But, maybe that goal will kind of spur him on, and then Dortmund suddenly have two strikers in form who are raring to go.
They feel like the winners of this game in many regards, and this is a good transition to actually talk about the positive side of the story, which is Borussia Dortmund. And I thought that equalizer, it was an extremely difficult goal to score. First, Adeyemi puts it in the box, right where Schlotterbeck is, and Schlotterbeck taking the time to stop the ball, taking a step himself behind the goal line, and then that pinpoint cross over the defense to where Modeste was at the far post. That was an extremely difficult play. And it underlines what you said last week, that Schlotterbeck is an excellent footballer who still needs to learn how to become a defender. Because he is an incredible good footballer. His passing is insanely good. But I think that as much pressure as Dortmund were under, and, this is often goals then come from Hail Mary plays, but that was actually a very well constructed goal overall. And I think that is actually something that you don't see in situations like that very often. Of course, Bayern Stanisic doesn't look very, very good in that defensive play either. And Neuer,
he's out of position, to be fair to the kids.
Yeah, he's out of position, right? But I mean, overall, for Dortmund to get a result like that, the reaction of the goal, the fact that they feel now that, and this is, I think, the big takeaway from this game, is that even though it was a late comeback, it does feel like they're on par with Bayern.
Yeah.
And
yeah, absolutely. And I actually thought for large chunks of the game, Dortmund I thought they looked at the better team in the first half. Obviously, the Goretzka goal kind of comes from nowhere. And then there's a kind of double whammy in the second half when Sani hits a shot that Myers really should be saving. And obviously, if Kobel's in there, then he probably does make that save. But it's really interesting to see what's happening at Dortmund right now, because I kind of touched about this in my newsletter this week, that the underlying stats haven't really changed for Dortmund just yet. But Terzic is obviously he feels like there's a degree of momentum in the team. And to kind of contrast this with the way that we were talking about Nagelsmann's comments after the game, Terzic was very much happy to kind of gloat about the fact that the players have bought into his system, and the fact that, hey, we might concede a few goals here and there, but at least everyone's running 100 miles an hour and we're scoring goals and we're having fun, Very different from Nagelsmann's kind of demeanor after the match. So he certainly thinks that things are beginning to, fall into place for him. And it'll be interesting to see if Dortmund can kind of make the most of this, because it'd be very typical of Dortmund to maybe go on and lose this game, or to win this game, sorry. They didn't win this game, but they picked up a draw, but then they've got Union Berlin next week.
It feels like a win.
Yeah. But then they've got Union Berlin next weekend, so we'll have to kind of wait and see if they can kind of keep this run of form going, or if it's just going to be more the same as we have seen under Terzic so far this season, where it's kind of stop, start. So we'll have to see how it plays out.
That next match day, by the way, obviously we're going to preview it in great detail, but that Sunday is insane. Dortmund is away at Union Berlin and Bayern Munich is at home against Freiburg. That doesn't sound like a lot when you take it into the context of ahead of the season, but that's first against third and second against fourth in this league, which,
as they would say in the Premier League, a Super Sunday.
It's a Super Sunday. It really is. And I think it's not false advertisement to call it that. And I think for both of those teams, it's going to be really interesting to see what lessons they're going to take away from the match on Sunday, and how they're going to translate them to the game. On the game on Saturday, to translate them to the matches on Sunday, because both Union Berlin and Freiburg, who I'm going to write my newsletter on based on my visit to the club and the city on Friday and Thursday and Friday last week, both those teams are very good, and both those teams could feasibly win the games. And increase the gap at the top two to Dortmund and Bayern, or Bayern and Dortmund. And we have to remember this. Neither one of those teams are first or second. It's Union Berlin and Freiburg. And Union Berlin at this point are 4 points clear of Bayern Munich.
Can you imagine the scenes if Dortmund and Bayern both lost last weekend?
Yeah.
It'd be really quite something.
And it could, I mean, this Union Berlin story is now lasting 9 match days. At one point, do we say there is something here?
Yeah. And on top of that, it's quite interesting that Freiburg are just kind of flying under the radar because they're doing just as well as Union Berlin, but they're not top of the table. So everyone focuses on Union Berlin, and this is exactly the way Christian Streich would prefer it.
Yeah.
In the sense that no one's really paying attention to them, just picking up big scalps every weekend. But long may it continue. It's been a fantastic start to the season. Couldn't have hoped for anything better.
Super fascinating. And I mean, talking about teams that are flying under the radar a little bit, Werder Bremen are 5th, just 1 point behind Dortmund and Bayern. There's been some fantastic storylines early on this year. And yeah, I think we've been really lucky. And I feel this could be one of those seasons that I had growing up in the Bundesliga, where you had 4 or 5 teams at the very top being really tightly together. And there is a weakness there at Bayern Munich. There really is. Their biggest signing, Sadio Mane, I don't want to call him a flop, but this feels like there's a little bit of a Premier League tax happening here because he's just not able to replace the outgoing players. He's just, a bit too streaky, which fair enough, he was at Liverpool as well, right? But you can say that same about some of the other guys. Matthias de Ligt was picked up an injury, right? And, Jamal Musiala tested positive for COVID today. Hope he's all right, but he's going to be out possibly all this week and then not feature next week. And he's been their best player. So there is a chance Bayern lose again next week.
Yep. And it'd be quite something, wouldn't it? It really would be incredible. And it's just fantastic. I mean, this season was always going to be bonkers because the World Cup in the middle of the season and things, and you never know. But the interesting thing here is that if you actually were to look at the start of the season from a Bayern Munich point of view, you would actually be kind of hoping to kind of rack up as many points as you could before the World Cup, because Bayern are going to be disproportionately affected by the World Cup more than any other team because every player in their team is an international.
Yeah.
Whereas, and you could maybe argue the same more or less for Dortmund.
Yep.
Union and Berlin and Freiburg, they do have a number of internationals, but not to the same, anywhere near to the same extent as Bayern or Dortmund. So we might actually find that this season actually, even though they're ahead right now, they might actually pull away in the second half of the season because they've got much fresher squads. So the fun may only be getting started.
Yeah, and that Union have the second best goal differential other than Bayern. Yeah, it's hugely fascinating, and I think if you're Union Berlin, you almost actually hope that Greg Berhalter remains blind and doesn't call up Jordan, because they probably want him rested when it all reboots, right? In January. But it's hugely fascinating. We're very lucky with the storylines, the way they have panned out, and I think if you are new to the league, you might have joined and following the league at just the right time, because it's been chaos. And long may it continue. I think that wraps it much up for this week, Stefan, unless we have anything else that you want to point out, discuss. I think we're pretty much set.
No, thoroughly enjoying the fun, and long may it continue.
Yeah, absolutely. As always, the show is brought to you by Bet Online. The newsletter this week, as Stefan said, Dortmund. Check it out. Mine will be on Freiburg. It will be out on Thursday in your mailbox. Been hugely impressed with the amount of feedback, positive feedback we have been getting. I think, Stefan, you may do something on the game that you are visiting.
Yes, I'll try and do a 4 thoughts piece from the Celtic Leipzig game. So subscribers will also be picking that up in their inbox, hopefully this evening, if they're listening on Tuesday.
It's bonus material. Don't get used to it. We're only doing it from big matches and games that we went to. But we've also recognized that you, the reader, really likes them. So we'll try to our best to give them to you as often as we can. And I've been hugely impressed by the feedback. It's a nice community that has been created there. So if you want to chat about the Bundesliga, head over to the newsletter. It's in the link in the bio of this podcast to click through, and it's on Twitter, on our Twitter handles. So please check us out. And we'll be back later this week with our bonus podcast, probably after the Champions League games on Wednesday. And then, of course, with our prediction podcast at the end of the week. So until then, auf Wiedersehen.
Kein Ende in Sicht.
Thank you for listening to Believe. You can show support to your host by subscribing to the show and giving us a 5-star rating on your preferred platform. Check us out at Believe.com and search for BLEAV on YouTube.